Well, good afternoon or good evening or good morning, depending on what part of the world we find you in. We're delighted to use the next hour and a half to wrap up what we've learned together in this odyssey in studying the future of work and asking how can we shape the future of work. And in fact, that is really the perspective that we have taken all the way through this course and the perspective we're going to take this afternoon, that we are not pawns of technology or of markets or of some other forces outside of our control, but in fact, if we put our minds to it and we work together, we can shape the future of work. The question is, what do we need to do? And as we go through this discussion this afternoon, we're going to draw very heavily on what you told us about what you're prepared to do, what you think others need to do as individuals, as institutions in our labor market, as companies that hire people, as government organizations, as educators. All of us have something to do, and we're going to draw on your insights. And Duan Yi is with me. Duan Yi has been our TA throughout this course and has helped many of you navigate through some of the issues on the technology and has helped to shape the content. And so you've already supplied a very nice, rich set of questions, and she's going to raise some of them. We invite you to continue to send questions to us through email by this email, 15.662x@mit.edu, or through Twitter with the hashtag that's listed there. And so our objectives are, what did we learn from you? What are your takeaways from this course? And what will you do in the future to shape the future of work for yourself and for others? So that's where we will try to go. I want to start by thanking all of the organizations that have been part of this team to bring this course together, starting with the edX platform and our good colleagues and friends at MITx who we've enjoyed working with. We've had real good input from our European colleagues at ADAPT. Thank you for all of the insights on what's happening in Europe and around the world that you brought into the discussions. Lee Dyer, my good friend and colleague, has taught a parallel course, and his class has participated. We're going to hear some of the takeaway lessons that Lee and his class at Cornell have come up with a little bit later. And then my friends and colleagues at the Sloan School and in our Institute for Work and Employment Research. We learn a lot of these things together by our teaching and our research. A lot of what we covered has come from that experience. So it takes a real team to put this together, and it also takes a great team of students. So we've had about 2,267 students from a wide array of countries, about 115 countries, about a third from the US, 2/3 from outside. You're a diverse group in terms of education and some other characteristics, gender and age, that I'll show in a moment. This is a bit higher level of education than we've seen in other classes in this program. About 50% have advanced degrees, 10% have high school or are working on college degrees, and another 35% have college degrees. A bit more senior group, 36 is the median age, but as you can see, it's a wide distribution from people in their teens all the way through some folks in their 80s who enjoyed reflecting on the world of work that they've been involved in over many years. And so we've learned from all of you, about 41% female and 59% male. So a good mix on those characteristics. The course is built around 3 basic messages listed here. And we're going to use these as an organizing principle as we go through. But we've emphasized that in order to shape the future of work so that it really works for individuals, it works for businesses and employers, and for our society, there are 3 steps that need to be taken. We need to find ways to make what we've called the high road businesses the norm and spread those as opposed to having them be the exception in their industries. We also need to rebuild worker bargaining power so workers have a voice and a constructive voice in shaping the future of work for themselves and for their peers. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly at this moment in history, when there are so many deep divisions in our societies, not just here in the United States where we are situated, but in Europe and around the world. We need to find ways to bring these different stakeholders together, and I believe that's entirely possible, feasible, and indeed it's our obligation to make it happen. So let's get on with talking about what we have in mind, and we'll take some of the questions that come along now and some of the ones that we've received already as we move through it. We started with a very standard assignment, asking you, what is your top priority for work? And this is what you told us. And it's a little bit different each year, but this year the most dominant factor was that you want to solve big and important problems. And you also want to have a lot of autonomy on your job, and you want to have a good work-life balance. But if you take these two, solving big problems and having autonomy on your job, those really tell us that you are ready to make a contribution to improving not only the organization where you are working, certainly that as a starting point, but also to contribute to society. And that, I think, is so refreshing to see in our young people today and in people who have been in the workforce for a number of years and are committed to making a difference before they retire or before they leave the workforce for other kinds of activities. And so that's really encouraging. Yes, you want to make a good living, but that fits into a mix of priorities. And then we probed a little bit deeper, and so let me just draw on a couple of your comments. And this is one that when we asked you to talk to your parents or someone from a previous generation, how do their aspirations compare to yours? There was a common theme that you built on their interests. You didn't walk away from them, but there's a common notion that you do want more autonomy. And you give your parents or the previous generations credit for giving you the opportunities that they might not have had to achieve the kind of goals and aspirations that you can attend to in your job today. So I think that's came through in lots and lots of comments. But there was also another theme, and this is from another member of the class, that basically said, you know, yes, that's important, but there are a lot of things that perhaps we're not saying because we're afraid to raise our voices at work. And this is a troubling comment, but I think it's real. And this one says, I believe that lack of employment security is driving many workers not to voice their concerns at work. I aspire to have more of a voice, not only for myself, but for others around me. But I'm worried about being discriminated against, and I'm worried about retaliation. But there are these issues out there that we need to address. That's a challenge for all of us, to find ways to allow people to express their voices in positive ways on issues, to improve operations, as well as to raise their voices when they think something is not being done right or fairly. And we're going to see this issue of fairness come up over and over in the comments that you offered about what you expect from work and what you expect from employers and what you expect from the next generation labor organizations, as well as other institutions in society. I think this is a very, very telling point. So we started with a good historical perspective. And we do this for a reason, not to emphasize that we should repeat history, but we want to make sure that we learn from history and we set the foundation of where we have come from. And this is a quote from my friend Lee at Cornell, and he said his students really appreciated that because while many of them, and they are in a school of labor and industrial relations, are familiar with that history, what we did was put it together to say there was an old social contract in the United States, and there have been efforts of other countries to put a social contract together, but in many of our settings, and particularly in the United States, that broke down. But there was a period of time from the 30s through the 70s when things did move together, where workers were getting better better conditions as the economy was getting better. And so laying that as the foundation sets up the notion that we've got work to do to restore that situation, that set of outcomes, But as I'm going to suggest from your comments, we're going to have to do it in some different ways. So we spent some time learning about what was that New Deal here in the United States, laying the foundation that was laid in the 1930s with our basic labor legislation, the New Deal as it was called, that provided unemployment insurance and Social Security, and this Fair Labor Standards Act provided minimum wages, and the National Labor Relations Act for the first time really providing workers the right to organize. Countries in other parts of the world had similar social safety nets and social legislation. Some of them came earlier, some of them came later, some of them came out of the aftermath of World War II, and they experienced in Germany and in Japan and in Italy what the lack of those basic human rights at work can do to a society. And so understanding where we've come from was a very important part of this course, and then building on it. And this one diagram, which you have seen over and over, illustrates what we had in the United States and what we have lost and what our challenge is to restore in some modern way. So from the 50s or the 1940s up through most of the 70s, we had wages and productivity moving together. That was the essence of that social contract that was achieved through collective bargaining, through raising the floor on minimum wages and labor standards over time. And then that broke down. And something happened in the late 70s and the 1980s where productivity continued to grow at a reasonable rate, but wages became very stagnant, and the resulting inequality is the situation that we face here in the United States most profoundly today, but we see in other parts of the world. Less so in continental Europe, in Northern Europe, heavily like the United States in Anglo-Saxon countries like Great Britain and in Australia. Not as severe as we have here, but this is symptomatic of the breakdown of the social contract. So, is that old social contract still relevant, or do we throw it all out? Here are a couple of comments that you offered in response to that question. And this comment basically says there's two features of the post-war social contract that still are clearly relevant. One is access to affordable education, and the second is emphasis on that basic labor standards foundation of unemployment insurance, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, disability insurance, and so on. But while we recognize those are important, we have to do it in modern ways. And this comment really captures that. We need to have portability of benefits. Instead of tying them to the individual firm, we need to go with the worker wherever the worker happens to be employed. We've got to make sure that in today's more fluid labor markets, those benefits aren't lost by changing employers. And so that's one major concern. And the second major concern that's raised in this comment is that we now have a much more diverse set of employment relationships. We call the gig economy independent contractors. We have contractors who are employed by temporary help agencies and so on. And we have a wide array of situations that are not covered by much of our safety net, at least here in the United States. This is where we have a lot to learn from some parts of Europe, where they are struggling to find ways to bring more of the contractors into this picture. So that's one set of issues that need to be updated. Well, what about your views of the firm? We emphasized that we need to have firms meet a whole series of obligations to you as individual employees and to their share owners or investors or whoever is the ultimate overseers, the ultimate customers of the business. And you emphasize the need for voice, for fairness, for flexibility, for transparency, and then something that we're going to really focus on here around the high road strategies. So voice is the first one that you mentioned in this comment. And you had some very specific ideas about voice. We're going to show more of that when we come to the social contract exercise. But this one is very specific, that all businesses over a certain size, maybe 100 employees, should have some form of worker voice and representation. And it should cover a wide variety of different issues, and it should provide opportunities for the full workforce to have some input into how their working conditions and the role of the organization gets structured. Lots of emphasis on flexibility and scheduling. Not surprisingly, given the workforce that we have today with dual career earners, we have dual mothers and fathers in the workforce, we have many single parents, we have to balance our work and family obligations, and we have the technology that should allow us to use scheduling algorithms to make this work effectively, and some organizations have been pushed to do that. Some are. Starbucks has moved to use the technology for scheduling much more effectively than it has in the past. But employees should not have to wonder when they are going to work. They should have some certainty about when they're being called in to work. Fairness was emphasized in a variety of different ways, from equal employment opportunity and protection against discrimination, as this one emphasizes, that businesses have to have policies and procedures in place that ensure people are treated with respect and fairness, regardless of religion and other demographic characteristics and preferences, and they have to be enforced. This is a challenge, as we have seen with the Me Too movement in the United States and around the world. It's gotten a lot of attention. I think this is a really positive development, because it's this kind of attention that tells us not only do we have a lot of work to do, but there are ways to address this. And we're going to see more and more people take fairness seriously, both as business leaders and as individual contributors, and as perhaps groups that organize around particular issues, whether it's sexual harassment at the workplace, bullying, or safety and health, immigrant rights. I think we are going to see a lot of emphasis on this, and we've got the tools to know how to address these if we work together. Particularly, a lot of concern today around pay and fairness norms and transparency. These are all the issues. These are the modern issues that you raised as concerns in your comments. So how do we do this? Well, you've seen this chart before. This is a major organizing principle for this course. We emphasize that there is no single one best way to maximize profits, as maybe we were taught in Economics 101. Instead, firms have choices. There's more than one way to compete and to achieve good profits. We can compete on the basis of minimizing labor costs, seeing what we call the low road, that is, we're not quite seeing the whole thing on the screen here, but maybe we'll, there we are, that's better. Where if we treat employees as costs, we're going to minimize their role in the organization. If we treat employees as assets, then we might be able to move to this high road quadrant where we can be both productive and profitable and provide good jobs for employees. And so the question is, how do we do this? Duanye?
Yeah. Hi, Tom. I got a question from the student asking, how can we realistically incentivize more business to adopt high road practices? Is the status quo too ingrained? So what's your opinion on this?
So this is the number one question. It's a very good question. It's the toughest one we face, and so let's build up to it. Let's see what we have to say. First, let's understand we've got examples across all kinds of industries: airlines, high tech, restaurants. We used the Market Basket case here in New England as a grocery chain, retail. So we know we can make high road strategies work effectively. And we can see it in some alternative forms of organizations, whether it's cooperatives or benefit corporations, employee ownership, the Mondragon example of cooperative organizations in Spain, or even community organizations, my favorite example of the Green Bay Packers. So we can see different organizational forms, but what's common about them? What's common about them is they invest in their employees, starting with selecting employees for both technical and social skills, making sure they invest in ongoing training and development, work to develop a culture of engagement and high trust at the workplace, making sure that they have job designs where people's skills are fully utilized, their knowledge is shared with each other, they teach each other, and they work together in cooperative ways in teams to get the work done. And then the compensation and the use of technology, as we'll talk about it, I have to reinforce all of these practices to make them work. And if there's a union situation, if it's a unionized organization, or if workers are organized into works councils or through co-determination, as they are in some European countries, we have to build partnerships. We have learned through lots of research, you can't get to this high road by having highly adversarial relationships, or in a non-union setting by having command and control strategies for the workplace and for managing the workforce. So these characteristics come out of about 30 years of research, much of it done here at MIT by our students and colleagues, and by colleagues around the country in the United States, in Australia, in Europe, in Japan, and elsewhere. And so if we understand how to do this, then the question that Duan Yi raised was also raised in one of these comments. What is it that holds us back? This is the big question. And I think we have begun to understand that, yes, there's some things that we can do individually, but we also need a government policy. We need national policies in our country and the other countries around the world that both block or take away the option for the low road, or slowly raise the standards in the low road with minimum wages, with higher safety and health standards, with high standards for equal employment opportunity, for enforcing basic wage laws, making sure that if workers want a union, they have an opportunity to get it, or if they want to form a works council or some other mechanism to get a voice, that they have those opportunities. That's going to help us to raise the floor on all companies, even the low road companies. And then if we combine that by supporting and providing incentives and rewards for those firms that are producing with high road strategies, are investing in their workforce, then let's start to recognize who they are. Let's rate them. Let's publicize them. Let's make that information knowledgeable to the workforce itself so people can move from low road to high road companies if they see that variation in their labor market. Maybe we should be using tax incentives or rewards for investing in training, since that's so critical to the high road firms. Maybe we can use government purchasing power to give credit for having high road standards. And in fact, we know that government can and should be supporting and endorsing the partnership form of labor management relations rather than the adversarial form. And so if we do these things with government policies, we may begin to see this move in the right direction. And in fact, one of the questions that we got was, what could government do to support labor management partnerships? Is there something in negotiations? Well, I've been involved in negotiations in partnership with, in the United States, the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, where they have worked to help organizations like Kaiser Permanente and others to learn how to use interest-based negotiations, problem solving in the negotiations process, supporting the building of partnerships, training labor and management negotiators in how to run good labor management committees on an ongoing basis on safety and health, on addressing issues as complicated as healthcare concerns and healthcare costs, and a variety of other issues. Government can play a role. Now, I don't think we have that kind of government policy in many places in the world. Some of us have been advocating for a much more activist Department of Labor that endorses these and sees this as part of its mission to improve the quality of jobs and the quality of employment opportunities. And that means it has to link across government to make sure that other agencies are using preferences for purchasing goods from high road firms, to make sure that we are enforcing all of these laws against the low road, to make sure that we are encouraging labor and management to work together. This is a package of policies that if we put our mind to it, we can help to spread the high road firms. But it's not just government policies. We also have to teach the next generation of managers and union leaders and government officials what it takes to build these so that we make this the norm. And that's maybe our responsibilities as educators, but for everyone else, we need to bring these practices into our organizations. You have to insist that these practices get followed. And if you can't get them to do it in a given organization, find the information on where the good employers are and move to them so that we put pressure on the low road firms. Dwani, another question?
Yeah, I get another question from our student asking, Dr. Koken, what's your view on the changing government that aim to reduce its involvement with business?
Well, someone is paying attention to what's happening in the world. Unfortunately, that's the world we're in. I have a very simple, maybe naive perspective on this. We will find a time when the world wakes up, when our citizens wake up, to say we need a constructive government policy, not one that is looking backward. I'm afraid that's where we are today in the United States. I'm afraid that some of the divisions that we're seeing in Europe are turning to extremes of populism, maybe extremes of the right side of the continuum, or in some cases even the left side. But all of them are receding from their responsibilities. And I think that's a terrible mistake. I think we have to stay clear, we have to stay committed, we have to have ideas that we're talking about here for what needs to be done, and we have to try to get out and talk more about all of these issues with people in the field, in your organizations, in your communities, in your religious institutions, churches and synagogues or mosques, or wherever you find community in your particular locations. And I think if we talk about these issues, and we do what we did in this class, we talk about each other's work experiences and aspirations, then we will start to see that there's a path forward, and we can then start to hold our elected officials accountable for moving forward in a constructive way. Now that's the optimistic scenario. I realize we're not there today, but we can't dwell on the problems of the moment. We have to have a vision that there is an alternative strategy, and yes, we could spend all of our time perhaps criticizing certain leaders in our countries or in other countries. But there's a time and a place for that. Our time, our place is to look to the future, to lay out a strategy and a vision for what we can do, and then keep discussing this with as many people as possible, convincing others that we understand the world of work, that we are listening to their concerns, and we have a path forward. So I'm actually more optimistic than pessimistic, because I believe that the world is ready for a change and ready to face these issues the way you have faced them in this course. And so this course gives me some confidence that we can address some of these issues if we put our minds to it. So that's what we have to say about the high road, about business. What about rebuilding bargaining power? There are two themes that came through, and both of these are a bit controversial. We need to support unions as we find them today and encourage innovations, because unions have had a very positive effect on improving standards around the world, but they're controversial. They engage in adversarial interactions. They go on strike sometimes. They pose rules that some managers find outdated and difficult to manage and to administer and to get the job done. And so we've got to learn from both the positive and the negatives. And we have to recognize, as another question that Duany got over the email was, what about union corruption? What do you have to say about that? You have a lot of positive things to say, but we also have some terrible examples of corruption here and elsewhere around the world. Well, that's right. So we have to look honestly at our past, to learn from it, to not accept it, to not accept unions as an ideological force that for good and bad we need to promote them. We need to help them to face their reality of today in a positive way, in an honest way. We need to call out mistakes of the past or current bad practices in labor, in management, in all of our institutions. So we have to understand that no institution is perfect, but we know enough about what needs to be done to move them in the right direction. And you laid out a whole series of ideas that we're going to take a look at right now. The second thing we said, it was also controversial, and that is there's a whole new set of labor organizations trying to find ways to give workers a voice, and we have to see them as complements, not as substitutes for existing unions and worker institutions or works councils or co-determination, but they're experimenting with ways to bring new uses of technology and social media to bear. And so let's find ways to support them to work in coalition with existing organizations and to see where we go. And so this is the kind of coalition that I would like to see. In the United States, we have the AFL-CIO, the largest federation of existing unions, and we have all kinds of interesting innovations going on. The Freelancers Union, that's been around for over 20 years now. The Restaurant Opportunity Center, a newer organization that helps to build coalitions between restaurant owners who want to follow the high road and their workforce as well as their customers. The National Day Laborers Organizing Network, the Domestic Workers Alliance, working on low-wage service employees, often in quasi-independent contractor, quasi-worker situations. These are all trying to find new ways. And I believe if they work with existing unions, as they are in some cases, and if the existing labor movement learns from these new organizations, then we will see a path forward. And you identified what you see as a path forward. Duany?
Yeah, Tom, before we go to the next section, I got another question from the student asking about if you know any effort by the labor unions to effectively work with management to provide constructive discipline or the on-job training to the employees, and how do unions look out for company, shareholders, consumers, and other workers when employees are not performing their job to their expectation?
That's a very good question. And it's a tough issue for unions, but it's one they have to face. And let's look at how we see this play out in some school districts around the country, because this, in the United States, has been one area where there's been a lot of criticism of unions for being too rigid. But in various settings, even here in the Boston School Department, there have been efforts to really work in partnership on scheduling, on extending the school day, on working with teachers who need performance improvement, by coaching them, by providing curricula that they share across the state, but with best practices and using technology. And so some groups of teachers who are looking at what's the best way to teach math in the 5th grade, what are the various kinds of innovations that are being used, what's been the experience with it, and then spreading that knowledge and coaching across the state. We need more union activity along those lines as opposed to just protecting people who are having difficulty in the classroom. We need performance appraisal systems that are fair, but that really do identify the people who are not doing the job and then hold them accountable and provide the coaching that's needed to improve, or the discipline that has to be imposed. That's part of being a responsible union. And we have seen across the country many examples of this, where unions are using their own social networks to help each other, to learn from each other. In California, there's a very famous school district, the ABC School District outside of Los Angeles, that's been a leader in this. We have seen coming out of Toledo, Ohio, a group that really emphasized peer review on how teachers can help teachers and evaluate teachers and work in teams to improve performance. These are examples of what we can do together. We've seen out at Kaiser Permanente the coalition of unions working in partnership with Kaiser to improve patient care, something that the unions were leading, to create a value compass where the center of that compass is the patient, and the frontline teams are working to improve customer service or patient satisfaction and service, working to solve problems with technology, with scheduling, with bottlenecks and communicating across doctors, nurses, technicians, and service employees. There are over 3,500 teams at Kaiser Permanente working on this with the support of a labor management partnership. That's the model of labor relations that works. We can do that through traditional collective bargaining. We can do it through works councils. We see in Europe where the works councils are playing a very active role in helping to think about issues around work and family and scheduling. We need to understand that process a lot better. We see co-determination helping to shape adaptations to changes in technology. We see in Germany at the moment, the German unions, the Metal Workers Union, has an agreement called on industry, what they call Industry 4.0, to think about how can we use new technologies effectively. So I think there are models, but we have to make sure that they, again, become the examples for the future rather than get stuck in our adversarial ways. And in fact, that's what you're saying here. That's what these two comments are saying. Let's use technology to serve not only existing workers, but also people in the gig economy and in alternative work arrangements. So unions need to use digital technologies in organizing, giving voice, and representing workers. They have to see the digital technologies as a tool for improving worker experiences and understanding what's happening, and then extend it to others. So a lot of comments from all of you in the class about this. You also emphasized the point that Dwani asked about corruption or lack of responsiveness to union members. That was in one of the questions raised. Well, you mentioned this. You said unions have to do a much better job of listening to their members, using bottom-up communication, and putting to work the various voice mechanisms that are more flexible, whether it's committees or employee participation or training in different ways of problem solving, training on technology so that they can get involved in early stage technology projects, various ways to make sure that that unions are on the forefront of raising workers' voices and taking advantage of the skills, knowledge, and motivation of their members to improve operations, improve the performance of the union, as well as to make jobs more meaningful and more satisfying. And we're seeing this in a lot of different ways, but we need to find ways to make sure that this spreads to other examples. Using data, big data, to collect information on where the good jobs are, what the experiences are, how the union is doing. The best unions collect a lot of information, but they also have what they call one-on-one relationships. That is, union leaders and union peers going out and talking to their peers about what's going on in their minds, in their experiences, and how to move these efforts forward. So there's a lot of room for improvement in how unions manage their own affairs that you're calling for. But you emphasized, perhaps more than anything else, that unions today really need to reinvest in what they are really good at, apprenticeships, training, but use the new technologies, update those apprenticeships, figure out ways to make sure that they are keeping in touch with and helping to shape new technologies. We see this with some support from the Department of Labor a number of years ago to develop new forms of apprenticeship in the manufacturing sector, where the current very narrow apprenticeships of electricians and tool and die makers and pipe fitters and so on are giving way to some extent to broader needs to integrate state-of-the-art computer technology into all of those. Maybe we need a mechanical apprenticeship classification that is more flexible and that is more up-to-date. That might not be the only way to do it. We may be able to work with existing apprenticeship models, but we have to make sure that we are keeping up-to-date with the changing technologies as we invest more and more in training. And then we also have to make sure that labor leaders are at the forefront of engaging technology and making sure that workers do have a voice in the design of the work systems that are coming along. So those are some of the things that you had to say about the future of labor. You're positive about the need for labor, but you want to see innovation, you want to see change, and you want to see more acceptance of labor in our societies than we see in some cases. Well, you also spent time talking about your own careers. We learned a lot about the range of careers that are reflected in the people participating in this class. This is just a sampling of them. It's a highly professional group of people in this class, perhaps a bit more than in other previous years. But we learned a lot about how you are thinking about your career development, whether you are starting out or whether you are at mid-career, or some of you as you transition into something that you might call retirement, but the next phase of what you want to do. All of you emphasized a lot about credentials, whether it's an apprenticeship, whether it's a college degree, whether it's a certification that you have achieved through an online class or some other mechanism, but emphasizing that you want to be public about what you have accomplished in your training, and you want to certify you meet certain standards to do advanced work. You've emphasized the importance of working together to keep your networks, your professional networks, current, so that you know where the opportunities are. This idea of lifelong learning plays an important role, and many of you talked about the different things that you are doing to take advantage of online courses and other opportunities to keep your skills current. And then a lot of you are making transitions in your careers, in some cases because of changing family situations and needs, but in other cases because you want to explore some new opportunities. And all of you emphasized that you're willing to work with technology if given the opportunity. And these are just three really neat examples of what you are saying you are doing to make sure that you're staying current with changing technologies. So this university lecturer said the skills in my area already are apparent, and I'm working on a day-by-day basis to take advantage of new ways of teaching, like this online course and other ways of departing and working with knowledge and working with students to make sure that we're teaching people in modern ways. The marketing specialist had a great line, said, "I set out to automate my job before somebody else automated me." Well, that's being proactive for sure. And then I really like this logistics manager who said, "I'm not only changing my approach to technology, but I'm really working with the people in my team that report to me to make sure that they too are developing the skills needed to be competitive in this wildly changing industry we call logistics, or warehouse working, or moving goods from one place to another," really on the forefront of technology. This is really encouraging. If people are thinking these ways and acting these ways, you're taking charge of shaping the future of work by working with technology. But this won't be easy. So let's talk a little bit about how can we shift our thinking in this age of digitalization. We emphasize this point very strongly throughout this course, and particularly when we talked about technology, that it's time to shift away from these wild predictions about how many jobs are going to be lost and how many jobs are going to be created, and start to really not only ask but work on the question of how do we use these advancing technologies to make work more productive, more equitable, more meaningful, and more inclusive so more people can benefit from technology. And I believe this is one of the biggest challenges we face today. I'm excited that there are so many groups around the world that we heard from over the course of these last 8 weeks that are addressing this, from New Zealand to parts of Europe to international groups like the OECD and others. The ILO is working all around the world with developing countries and with advanced industrial countries and labor and management and government organizations. We're starting a group here at MIT to look at these issues across our institute with engineers and scientists and social scientists, and some of us in the management school. So I think we can do this, but it won't be easy. Duany?
Hi, Tom. Thank you. So I got a question from, I assume it's an international student, asking how Africa will take advantage of technology and implement and create high-road companies.
Well, one of the things that was most inspiring for me over the course of this semester, it wasn't in our course, but I did mention it in one of our weekly updates. There was a conference here sponsored by our Sloan School MBAs about innovations in Africa. And we saw the possibilities, because I had the good fortune to chair a panel or facilitate a panel discussion with 4 really, really creative young entrepreneurs from Africa, from Ghana, from Kenya, from Rwanda, and other places. And they illustrated the power of new ideas and the willingness of young people in Africa, all of whom have the technology of iPhones or some form of mobile device available to them, not completely distributed in all the rural areas, but moving in that direction. They're urging their countries to invest in broadband. They're providing people the skills needed to contribute to technology, to upgrade their technical skills, to improve the quality of education, to build a next generation workforce that is healthy, that is well fed, that has the basics that they need to be able to learn effectively, so they see it in holistic ways, but then also to provide them with advanced understanding of technologies and the social skills needed to engage these technologies. So I think there are tremendous opportunities, tremendous challenges. And the thing that we have to do as we invest more in Africa, as the Chinese invest more in Africa, as Europeans invest more in Africa, and as American companies invest more in Africa, we've got to hold our investors accountable for building the kind of high road firms. If those entrepreneurs have their way, they are going to have people who are going to expect to have the best technologies, the best opportunities to thrive as entrepreneurs, and provide the best opportunities for spreading those benefits. That's a big challenge. But first, we have to end some of the civil strife that's going on in some parts of Africa. We have to make sure the governments are not only democratic, but also efficient and responsive. And we've had some good examples and some terrible examples of that in the history of that continent and countries in that continent in recent years. But I think if we can get the right democratic structures in place, then I believe there's a generation of young professionals ready and able to bring technology to bear in that part of the world, and maybe even leapfrog some of us in other parts of the world, because they have an opportunity to go right to the frontier of using technology to solve their problems. So I'm optimistic about Africa, but we have to hold the investors who are going there not to go there to expect that they're going to turn it into a continent that is the next haven for low wage, low skill, highly controlled managerial systems, but it's a place where they can invest, build the infrastructure for the future, and make sure that they take advantage of the talent that's already there, particularly among these young professionals. So if I had one message, it would be the young professionals in Africa really need to come together to make sure that they are supporting each other and that they're holding not only government officials accountable, but also outside investors accountable when they come there and show that they've got the talent needed to do this. But what do we need to do to make this a reality wherever we happen to be? Well, we talked about some changes. And this diagram is something that I've been working on with a couple of consulting organizations over the last several months as we learn about how technology is actually being implemented in our organizations. And what we found is that most technological implementation processes follow what's referred to here as a sequential strategy. That is, somebody gets a great idea, maybe it's an outside vendor, maybe it's somebody in the organization, and they say this is going to be the technology, then they start to implement it, and then they come to the workforce issues down the road and say, do we have the right mix? Do we have the right skills? Do we have too many of one kind of work group and not another? And that's too late. That model will fail. That model will mean we'll overinvest in technology, we'll have a long period of time before we see the benefits of it, and we won't get the full return on it. And you will have resistance from the workforce. We need to replace that model with a more integrated model that brings all of these pieces together, where we invest continuously in training of the workforce, where we bring the workforce issues and the technology issues together to change how we work, to change the tasks, to mix the tasks in ways that allow people to use their skills to make that technology work. The Japanese have this good phrase, it's workers who give wisdom to machines. We need to make that the motto of how we integrate technology and workforce decisions and work design decisions. If we do that, I think we will be successful. That means we've got to train workers. We've got to invest a lot in training, but not when the technology hits the organization, but on a continuous basis so they have the knowledge before the technology comes on how to use that technology effectively. So that means we've got to expand our apprenticeships, and we need to work together to get firms in an industry and in a labor market to work together to invest in training. We need to make sure that we make lifelong learning a reality, and most importantly, what we have learned is we need to train for hybrid skills. Yes, we need good technical and data analytic skills. That's a starting point, but we also need problem-solving skills, teams, be able to lead teams, to participate in teams, to solve problems together. And we know that that hybrid set of skills are now in high demand in industry around the world. So if we prepare the workforce for the future, they can shape the technologies in ways that really work. So in summary, on the technology side, we emphasized an integrated strategy with 4 points. First, let's make sure we understand what problems we're going to solve. Let's involve people in identifying how we design technology to solve those problems. Let's shift from this sequential to a more integrated strategy so workers can give wisdom to those new machines and new technologies. Let's train before the technology comes along. And then, yes, some people are going to be displaced. That's the history of technological change. There's no getting around that. And therefore, we've got to make sure that we compensate people so that there isn't another great divide in society that we create winners and losers. We've got to make sure that we follow these principles as we introduce new technologies. So let's now go to our capstone exercise. And I really appreciate the contributions that you made to help us take all of what we've learned and ask the question, how do we build a new social contract? What do we want business to do? What do we expect educators to do? What do we expect from labor? And what do we expect from government? So you've been very busy over the last 4 weeks in providing these inputs. We have taken those inputs and put them together. What we have done is to ask you to first identify what you believe are the key issues for business, labor, education, and government. And then we took what we called phase 1 inputs and we combined, we looked across your proposals, we identified the common themes, we put the highest priority ones into a summary, and then in phase 2 we asked you to rank these proposals in terms of the priorities that you would assign, and on the end we get a social contract for the future. So let's take a look at what this produced. In phase 1, basically the highest priority came in 3 out of the 4 groups, stakeholders, to emphasize improving workforce capabilities. This idea of investing in our workforce. The notion that we can't have high-road firms if we don't have highly skilled workers. We can't use technology effectively unless the workers have the skills and knowledge and training available. And so this is a priority for business, and it's a priority that is expected businesses to work together with educators, with competitors in their labor markets and product markets, and with labor unions that exist that work on apprenticeship programs. But this was number 1 priority. But there are other issues around the need to pay adequate and fair rewards, and to worry about families and communities, and to make sure that we're following high road principles. So education, training, workforce capabilities for business came out number 1. Not surprisingly for educators, it did as well, because that's what educators do, is work on these issues. But you were much more specific about what you want from educators today. You want to make sure that they are up to date in understanding what technologies are needed and what's in demand in industry and how is that changing. And you want to make sure that people are getting trained in both the technology, analytic skills, as well as these behavioral and social skills. And you want to make sure that basically what we do in education, particularly with young people, all the way from pre-K to high school and beyond, is instill a real deep interest and capability for learning, for ongoing learning, a taste for learning, a thirst for learning, working together, modeling how the workforce, workplace today and in the future relies on teams and asks people to work cooperatively and to coordinate their efforts, to communicate their efforts, to use technologies to develop new ideas and new applications. So there was a very, very strong message for educators to get on with those tasks. For labor, not surprisingly, the top priority was make sure that people are getting treated fairly. Keep up your efforts to negotiate fairness at the workplace, to make sure that you have a role in providing workers a voice in the future. But also you'll see at the top here that workforce capabilities came in very high on the labor side as well. For government, again, the emphasis on workforce capabilities. So you're sending a very, very clear message to our leaders of these stakeholders. Get on with this task of training the workforce so it's prepared for the future from early pre-K all the way through lifelong learning. That seems to be the theme not only this year, but has been the common theme, the most important priority for every class that we have done this now over the last several years. So you know the importance of education and training, and we have to keep that going as we move forward. But let's now go to phase 2, and let's look more specifically at the kind of proposals, because it wasn't just checking a box that we asked you to do. about what's important. We asked you to be specific. And many of you wrote very, very detailed statements about what you expect these stakeholders to do on these particular issues. Our job was not an easy one, to take all of the interesting ideas and proposals that you made and boil them down to short statements that reflect the consensus of your contributions. So that's what we have here now. And we'll start with what you saw as the highest priorities for business. And we have ranked them in terms of which was the priority that you said was number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Number 1 being the most important, and 5 being less important. You want to hold business accountable for having fairness, to having an agile and innovative high road firm, and then sharing those benefits with fair compensation and with a way for employees to share in the profits or the increased productivity that they help to develop. And again, you combine the emphasis on fairness and compensation with investments in development of the workforce. The workforce is willing to put some of their compensation package into training and development because they know that that's very important, and they want business to be responsive to that concern and to put their money in that direction. So that was a very, very strong statement, followed by more specific statements about businesses should be investing in training on a lifelong basis so that people can keep up with their technology and technological changes that are happening in their occupations and in their industries. Fairness was very important, and particularly here that employers should create mechanisms for workers to have a collective voice. And you ranged from saying, let's strengthen collective bargaining, to saying, let's learn from the European Works Council and co-determination mechanisms, to various forms of partnerships and community involvement, and opening up to a broader array of stakeholders that need to be involved in these decisions. But you want business to accept the notion that they can't do this alone, and they have to respect worker rights to have a voice in the affairs of the organization and in the decisions that affect the quality of their jobs and their future security. So this is a very, very strong statement, and one I think that sends a clear message to colleagues in the business community. Whoops. Going too fast here. Other points, a lot of emphasis, even though it comes out number 4 and 5, around high road firms, around making sure that firms are paying attention to the families and the communities and worrying about scheduling and flexibility and child care services, things that we have talked about earlier in your qualitative comments, came through very loud and clear. So this is what you had to say. Business, in your mind, needs to be held accountable to build a social contract to take on these responsibilities. What about education? Well, here you actually emphasized organizational performance as your top priority, but basically this was a statement that educators can't do it alone either. They need to work with industry. They need to make sure that they are in a continuous dialogue with industry representatives to obtain information, up-to-date information on skills that are most relevant today and tomorrow. This is a plea for community colleges, for technical schools, for high schools, for universities and colleges all over the world to say, get out of your silos, talk to people in industry, bring people from industry, bring labor representatives into the classroom, learn about the current technologies. We just, in another class that I teach yesterday, had a great example of Nissan in Tennessee in the United States, and all of the work that they are doing to bring young people into the manufacturing operations, to show them that auto manufacturing isn't any longer a dark and dirty and dangerous occupation. It's full of uses, opportunities to use technology, to use robotics, to use various data analytic tools, and giving students a hands-on feeling and bringing them in so that they can see that there are investments in training and apprenticeships available in that particular industry that pay a very, very good wage and have career progressions going with it. It's that kind of educating the educators that's so important, and Nissan brings educators in the summer to show them the technology, to help them understand what's needed, and then to provide some of that technology into the classroom so that there is a seamless relationship and process for making sure that the educators know what's in high demand and how to deliver that knowledge effectively. Then obviously more on workforce capabilities, and also a recognition that in many of our countries, and particularly here in the United States, we are not paying teachers enough to be successful in their profession. We have let wages and labor standards in the teaching profession slide downward after being elevated through collective bargaining from the 1970s through the 90s and into this century. In the last decade, we have seen an erosion of wages and representation rights of teachers, and we may see even more of that. You sent a very clear message. That's the wrong direction for the education community. It's the wrong direction for our country. It's the wrong direction for our society and for the next generation workforce, and you want it changed. And again, emphasizing fair treatment and community issues. We've already talked about the labor proposals that have come forward, the importance of apprenticeships. Unions are experienced with apprenticeships, but we have to make sure they're updated to fit with the nature of technology as we find it. And then you were very clear. You want labor leaders, whether they are union leaders or works council representatives or some of these emerging forms of worker advocacy, to understand the need for high road strategies, for work to help improve firms to compete on the basis of high road strategies, to engage their members in processes to foster continuous improvement, and to make that the modus operandi, the signature approach to representing workers in the modern economy. Some labor leaders are doing this. Many worker advocates are encouraging this. That's what I mentioned, the restaurant opportunities centers are encouraging this with restaurant employees and employers to develop the capacity to have high road restaurants. We need more of that from our labor leaders, and that's what you emphasized in these proposals. And so when you do that, then you want unions and labor organizations to negotiate for a fair share of the improvements that are achieved and to upgrade standards and to make sure that there is fairness in our compensation systems. And finally, you want labor leaders to open up. You want them to be reflective of the community. You want them to be representative of the community. You want people from the community to move into labor leadership roles in all of the diversity that we find. And we want our labor leaders to be attentive to the needs of families for parental leave and sick leave, and to make sure that we are developing child care for all people in our society. These are the calling cards that you laid out for the labor movement of the future, and let's see if we can help to generate it. And then finally, and we've emphasized this about government already, but you want government to update its policies, to catch up with the changes in the workforce, to make sure that they are providing fairness at the workplace. And then a number of you laid out specific ideas for not only making sure that the policies and procedures are in place, but that there's a way to resolve disputes fairly and effectively and efficiently. And those of you who have experience in Europe identified how labor courts work, where there are specialized judges who know something, who are trained, who learn about how workplaces operate and what the particular needs are, as opposed to judges who deal with criminal cases or other civil cases. Well, maybe it's time to find ways to bring that expertise into the dispute resolution processes. There are many people now who are developing alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. Some of them are very unfair, and some of them don't meet the standards of due process. But we can improve that, and we can address that if we put our creative minds to work and learn from what we know are effective dispute resolution systems. So there's an emphasis on government being more active in that area. Clearly, the support for training, and particularly government's role in retraining the workforce that is most adversely affected by the changes in technology, changes in our markets, and international trade, is clearly something that you highlighted. And then finally, to come back to points we've already made, you do want the government to become an advocate, a catalyst for high road firms. And we've talked about ways that that can happen, and you clearly see that as a necessary condition. So let's see, where did it come out? We asked you to rate these social contracts that you generated on a 10-point scale, and you can see that we're in a good range. 7.9 or 7.8 is the average. It ranges from 7.5 to 8.0, but there's still a ways to go, and there's a distribution. Some of you didn't see these proposals strong enough. So keep raising your voices. This is only a template to say, if we can do this in our classroom, after we study these issues and we talk about these issues and we debate these issues, then could we take this out to our colleagues in the world, in our communities, in our professional organizations? Can we get business and labor to sit down and try to engage in this kind of dialogue and rebuild a social contract through constructive and respectful dialogue? That's why we do this exercise, to demonstrate it can be done, to demonstrate that well-informed people who think about this and study it and talk about it over a period of time can come up with constructive recommendations, many of which are very similar to each other, and then some creative ideas that may not be totally reflected in the summary proposals put on the charts here. But it's that kind of dialogue that will, in some fashion or another, be the raw materials for creating the next generation social contract. So congratulations on the work that you did on this, and the way in which you've demonstrated that we can make some progress. As we sum up, let's look at what our colleagues from the Cornell ILR School took away as key takeaways from this class, and then we're going to see if Duany has one or two more questions that you're raising as we go along here this afternoon. So I asked Lee and his class to summarize. What do they see? And these are students who are studying human resources. So they are going to be the next generation of leaders in the human resource profession. And here is their neat little list of takeaways. And they start with leadership and recognize that they as managers do have some clout, some influence to make a difference. So they better start to lead in a positive direction by embracing the high road, but they can't do it alone. And this, I think, is very refreshing. If I look back over the many years I've been in this field, I've seen labor and management work together very effectively over the years. And then over time, the HR profession, the labor relations managers, the unions all separate into their own little camps, and we've lost the ability to really have this dialogue. I am delighted to see that the next generation of HR professionals recognizes the need to build the coalitions, to sustain them, and to lead those coalitions with all of the talent. Even when we disagree, we can respectfully disagree, and out of those disagreements can come creative solutions, innovative new ideas, and sometimes the compromises needed to make sure that we respect the rights and needs of all the stakeholders. I'm delighted to see that that's where this class wants to go and is determined to go. And they recognize that they're going to need a lot of grit, as the term goes, to be persistent, that right now the future is not acting in this way, but they have to be persistent, and that we have to be patient, because it took us, as they say, 40 years to dig the hole that we're in, so it may take a while to pull us out of it. Well, I think that's a great summary. I think that's I hope that not only the students at Cornell take this list and post it on their wall so that they see it every day they work in their careers, but perhaps this is a list we should all take and post on our walls and make sure that we live these principles as we go through our careers. So thank you for those contributions from colleagues at Cornell. So, in sum, what's our message to the workforce? Well, it's the point of being redundant. It's education, education, education. Plan your careers. Make sure you explore new opportunities. Make lifelong learning part of the norm for yourself and for others, to keep those skills up to date. Be ready to move. Keep that resume up to date, to move to where the good jobs are, and penalize those employers that don't follow a good job strategy. Make sure that we send that message that we're going to go and work and the talent is going to flow to the best employers. And that means we use all of our talents to invent the next generation of labor organizations, to use social media to improve the workplace as well. And so if there's a bottom line message to the workforce, it's get involved. Don't be passive. You can shape the future of work for yourself and for others. Strong messages to our leaders, back to those 3 points. Make the high road the norm, not the exception. Let's find creative and effective ways to rebuild worker bargaining power in a modern way, using modern technologies and modern sources of power. And then finally, let's get business and labor and government and education all on the same page, working together, respecting each other, rebuilding the dialogue. Those messages came throughout these 8 weeks. I think they are a framework for moving forward, and I know that I have now great confidence that people who are participating in these kinds of courses and discussions are ready to take on these tasks. So Duany, maybe we've got time for a few more questions that people have raised for us that weren't on our list.
Sure. So I have the first question about education. So the student asked, could you please compare the way education, especially colleges and universities, used to be funded versus today? And she also asked about your personal experience. When you attended the University of Wisconsin, what type of funding did it receive? How much it was cut back? And over what time frame? What can we do to restore the funding to education?
Well, this is a story that is a very sad story. Both my colleague Lee Dyer and I had the good fortune to get our education at the University of Wisconsin in a long time ago. In the 1970s, the state of Wisconsin provided 43% of the budget for the university. Today, that's down to about 17%. That's a tragedy. And we've seen that university struggle to adapt to these budget cuts, having to go out and raise more money from the private sector, from research foundations. Wisconsin has always been a university on the forefront of research in the engineering, in the physical sciences, in promoting better health care and finding new discoveries, as well as in the social sciences, in sociology, economics, and in employment and industrial relations. A lot of that has been weakened by these budget cuts. And so we have to, as a society, and it's not just the state of Wisconsin that's cut back, but you're seeing across the country, teachers revolting, and we talked about it in one of the updates, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, Kentucky. All of these states are beginning to say we aren't funding our educational institutions at the local, at the high school level, or at the college level adequately. And so we need to bring more and more awareness, and maybe we do have to raise our voices effectively to get the attention of politicians. But if we don't invest, then we will pay a terrible price. The university system in the United States is one of our crown jewels. It is one of the areas we still are among the best in the world. And if we lose that, we lose a very, very critical source of competitive advantage. So we need to reinvest as citizens. We need to make sure that we reduce the cost of education, because education is too expensive for many, many people. And we have to increase access. Here at MIT, we put a lot of energy into making sure that we have a needs-blind admissions policy. That means we don't look at whether people can afford or families can afford to come here when we make admissions decisions. We admit students who we think have the talent and the motivation to succeed here, and then we figure out how much we have to raise the funds to support them and to make it possible for them to come. And so we are going to have to do more of that in education, but we also have a responsibility to find new ways to become more productive. That's why we're experimenting with online courses like this. I believe we can extend this in various ways. We'll never substitute for having the direct dialogue that I can have with my students on the campus, in the classroom, and debate these kinds of issues, but we can lower the costs. We can be more economical in sharing curricula. We can be more economical in using videos and what we call flipped classroom strategies to mix online and in-person teaching. Lots of things we can do. We've got to lower the cost. We've got to reinvest with public resources. And we all as a society need to put our investments into supporting the workforce of the future, but to do that in creative ways. And so the partnerships between industry and universities has to grow, not to control the universities, but to provide the resources and to provide the links to good jobs so that the internships and help with curriculum and help with technology and help with mentoring students all is seen as ways to make this more accessible.
So we get a lot of questions on the high road. So this is another question probably raised by our colleague from MIT. So he says, what get measured get managed? And how could you evaluate management to make sure they take a high road strategy? And what combination of measures and metrics could you recommend?
Well, that's a very, very good question. It's absolutely essential. If we don't measure how we are doing as an organization and how we are doing as managers in encouraging the high road, we aren't going to get there. And so we've got to make sure that we are holding managers accountable. We've seen the costs in all of these exposés around sexual harassment that have been suppressed for so many years. And now the Me Too movement is giving people much more confidence to raise awareness and to report bad behavior, inappropriate behavior at the workplace. Well, we have to hold organizations accountable. We can't wait for the crisis. We should be managing, we should be making sure that every manager understands his and her responsibilities to provide fair treatment and to provide opportunities for development of the talents that are in the workforce itself. And if we don't put that into the performance appraisals, then and to the promotion decisions and into the compensation decisions of managers, we're not going to get there. So that's principle number one. Let's reward people for supporting the workforce, for engaging the workforce, for giving voice to the workforce, for helping to develop the workforce and giving them the opportunities to contribute, and hold them accountable if they're not doing that. Number two, I think we have to recognize that the compensation structures that have allowed the expansion of the differential between executives and average workers has to close. We've got to have more equitable compensation systems, and we've got to hold firms accountable. And here I would ask that Wall Street begin to ask, what are you doing in your businesses to promote the high road, to put those practices in place, learn what we're teaching in this course and many, many others now about how we have to manage to achieve the high road, and make sure you hold the businesses accountable for having those practices in place rather than just look at the cost structure. And so I think we've got to get Wall Street on board with everything that we've been teaching in this course, as well as to get individual executives and the compensation system and the performance evaluation systems in place. So maybe time for one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Sure, we have a lot of international students. One person asked about what do you think work will change with the new immigrations waves in the United Nations, in the European Union?
Well, the conflicts over immigration are really troubling. I worry that we're pulling ourselves apart. We're going to more extremism. We're creating cleavages between immigrants and people who are natives to the different countries, and we simply have to face that issue. We have to keep speaking out for decency, for common decency, for taking care of those people who are refugees from violence or from natural disasters. That's part of our heritage. If we look at the history of European countries as well as the United States, we have grown on the basis of immigration. We depend on immigrants. We couldn't function as an economy without immigrants from all over the world, people who are taking entry-level jobs and performing many of the services in our society. The same is true in Europe, as well as the talent that's flowing in because the opportunities aren't possible in one's home country. Well, let's start focusing on our common goals. Let's deal with some of the shortages of labor that we find in Europe and in some parts of Asia, and certainly here in the United States, and let's take advantage of the skills and let's respect each other. I spend time in our family. One of our sons has a restaurant, and I see the power of the immigrants that work in that industry, and the people and the community that gets built, and the way in which our son relates to people who are doing much of the work to prepare the food and to deliver the food. And it's a community, and he is a very strong advocate for immigrant rights. Well, more people need to see that on the front lines, wherever we find them in the world, whether it's Europe or the United States, and just engaging and watching the work that the immigrant communities are doing to make our society stronger, to make our family structure stronger, to improve our understanding of diversity, and to delivering the services that they're capable of providing. That, I think, is the way forward. So we have extended our time. What's next? Well, we'll post these materials in this wrap-up seminar on the website and for the course, and also on the website of our center. We will make sure that we take your ideas to business and labor and government leaders and community leaders for how to build a new social contract, and we'll think about how we can improve this course with your suggestions and with your ideas and where we can go from here. So we want to wrap up by both Duan Yi and myself and Christina, who helped us put a lot of these materials together. Thank you for making this such a rich, mutual learning experience for us. Keep up speaking up for the good work that you know is possible and is needed in our societies, and always remember that all of us can make a difference. So thank you very much.